It's always a guy. It's like, man, she saved my life. She made me such a better man. I'm so much less of like a, since she came into my life. But very rarely do you hear the other flip side. Like,
but yet you don't see it on screen often. But I think that's why like men and women see this movie. They're not just like.
Directing is a very complicated job. You have to hold the entire vision of the movie in your head and then find ways to communicate it and get everybody on the same page. And then acting is its own animal. Acting, especially with a role like Ryle, with complex, deeply painful, disturbed man, it's very hard. And there were many times, throughout the course of the movie where it was challenging. And as a director, it's my job to navigate all the personalities and to figure out how to get us all in the same direction. And yet those challenges are also beautiful. And we work together to create this beautiful piece of art, and I'm proud of it. And I believe that the cast is proud of it, and Colleen's proud of it, and I hope at the end of the day that the fans will be proud of it.
Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. If you're Blake Lively today, you're probably not feeling great about this case, because things just took a serious turn. Blake is now facing a powerful motion to dismiss that was just filed by Jed Wallace. And let me tell you, his arguments are very solid. I'm not sure she's going to come out on top with this one. And honestly, his attorney, Charles Babcock, gave one of the sharpest, smartest, and most entertaining legal responses I've seen in a long time. Now, this matters because if Jed Wallace gets dismissed from the case, it could totally derail Blake Lively's entire lawsuit. And here's why. Jed is right at the heart of the theory she's pushing. She strongly believes he was the one who kicked off a whole online smear campaign that spread across social media, posting harsh and false things about her. According to Blake, Jed Wallace is the key player who changed the entire online narrative about her, but now Jed has signed a sworn declaration denying all of that. He's told the court that he had nothing to do with any of it, and he even explained in detail exactly what he did for Wayfair, making things more complicated. Jed went on to explain the job he did, who he talked to, and the instructions he gave, which were basically to do nothing. According to him, Blake Lively was already getting plenty of organic backlash online, and there wasn't any need to stir things up. The internet had mostly taken Justin's side, and there was no real reason to push back or try to change the conversation. In his eyes, they didn't even need to defend Justin, because the internet had already made up its mind and was clearly not on Blake's side. Most of the backlash she faced came from Colleen's fans and people who had watched the film, so it looked like things were just unfolding naturally. Justin didn't have to step in then. And honestly, he doesn't really have to do anything now either. Blake keeps ending up in a bad light, and it seems like her team is struggling to turn things around. She's trying hard to keep this case alive by arguing that New York has jurisdiction over Jed Wallace. But here's the thing. Jed lives in Texas, and federal courts don't play around with jurisdiction rules. If he didn't live in New York, didn't aim any of his actions directly at New York, and isn't tied to a New York-based company, it's a tough sell. He's a Texas resident, and that gives him a pretty strong chance of getting the whole case thrown out just based on jurisdiction. And I know this firsthand. When I got sued in federal court in Washington, I wasn't a resident, and everything I did was from Minnesota. Since the case had no connection to Washington, it was tossed, and that's likely what could happen here too. It doesn't mean Blake can't refile the case later, but if Jed Wallace gets dismissed, the whole case against Wayfair starts to fall apart. Without him included, her overall argument becomes very, very weak, almost to the point of collapsing. Jed's legal team is also saying she failed to state a valid legal claim. And honestly, if I'm being real with you, I think they might have hit the mark. It looks like the standard for dismissal based on failure to state a claim may have actually been met here. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I did reach out this afternoon to Omar, the tilted lawyer, to get a second opinion. He told me he plans to go live and stream his take on it later today. But he did say that he thinks there's a real chance Jed's motion could succeed, and the case against him might be tossed out. Jed himself is arguing that the New York federal court doesn't have jurisdiction over him at all. He says he's a resident of Texas, runs his business there, and didn't direct any work related to the case toward New York. In fact, Jed is using his own sworn declaration to push back strongly against Blake's claims. He says the complaint has no real proof of him doing anything wrong. There's no communication that links him directly to the events, and she can't even describe what specific role he played. That's a big problem for her case. Here's just a small part of what his legal team wrote in the motion. Blake, according to them, is incorrectly asking the court to disregard Jed's signed declaration, which the law actually supports. But even if the court ignores it, she still has the burden to prove conspiracy jurisdiction. And yet, she hasn't laid out where or when the conspiracy happened, who was part of it, or what actions they took. On top of that, none of the alleged co-conspirators are New York residents, which makes her argument for New York jurisdiction incredibly thin, except for one very minor point they already address. Yes. The filing continues. It points out that Blake hasn't clearly shown how the alleged conspiracy was actually aimed at New York. The complaint doesn't even try to define any territorial limits for this so-called sophisticated, well-funded retaliation campaign, which supposedly tried to silence or destroy anyone who challenged Billon's brand, not just New Yorkers. Another big issue is the timeline. Blake never explains exactly when the Ballast parties joined this alleged conspiracy or what specific actions they took to further it within New York. Plus, there's no indication that Jed Wallace was even aware of those actions, let alone that they happened in New York. It really is a strange decision for her to file the case in New York. The filming didn't take place there. The contract she signed is actually governed by California law. And Billon doesn't live in New York either. None of the people from Wayfair, the ones she's suing, are based in New York, which makes her jurisdictional claim look even weaker the more you look at it. In general, for a court to have jurisdiction over a defendant, the plaintiff needs to file in the state where the defendant resides or operates. By choosing to sue someone from another state, Blake has to show the court exactly why it has the authority to hear the case. And Jed's team is arguing that she hasn't done that. They're saying flat out that the court lacks jurisdiction over him. The motion also says that even if the court decides to look at the claims on their merits, it should still dismiss them, particularly the claim of intentional infliction of emotional distress. Blake tries to argue that Wallace and Straight did a lot more than just make public statements, but her own complaint doesn't back that up. Ironically, her legal citations from California actually support dismissal, especially for claims like false light. Whether New York law or Texas law is applied, the core issue remains the same. All of Wallace's alleged actions happened in Texas, and while Blake may have felt the impact in New York, that alone isn't enough to prove jurisdiction. FEA, the section Lively refers to in the complaint, doesn't really prove that Jed Wallace had any actual knowledge of what was going on. That's a big problem for her case, because why would he know? He's not in California, and her main argument hinges on a California issue. The legal team points out that in trying to argue for personal jurisdiction, Lively never actually names a single co-conspirator who committed a specific act in New York that falls under New York Statute 302A-2. That law requires that someone took action while physically present in New York, something that could then potentially be connected back to Wallace through her conspiracy theory claim. But even there, she doesn't once cite New York's long-arm statute, which is critical, in cases like this. Just like how alleging a conspiracy isn't a substitute for showing purposeful availment, meaning you can't just say someone was involved in a conspiracy and expect that to establish jurisdiction. She's facing a serious issue here because for the court to accept jurisdiction over an out-of-state defendant like Jed, she has to prove something actually happened in New York, and that something can be directly tied to Jed's actions. But according to his motion, she doesn't even try to argue that anything Jed personally did had anything to do with New York. He had no business there, no connections, and no intent to target anyone in that state. That's how disconnected he is from this entire case. And when it comes to proving Wallace's involvement in the conspiracy, Lively's only support in the entire complaint boils down to just 2 paragraphs, both of which mention that Tag allegedly hired Wallace, but don't show any proof of what he did, how it connects to New York, or when any of it happened, and street relations to create and execute a so-called social combat strategy. But when you actually look at the complaint, the first paragraph she cites includes text messages between Abel and Nathan, neither of which even mention Wallace or street relations. The second paragraph is even weaker. It's just an allegation, made on information and belief, that Tag supposedly brought Wallace on board around early August 2024 to work on this plan. But here's the problem. That's exactly the kind of vague, speculative claim that courts often toss out. Jed's team is pointing out that Lively is making a leap. She's reading into Nathan's words about a possible social combat strategy and then assuming, without evidence, that Wallace was hired to carry it out. Nathan never said that. There's no message, no document, no proof anywhere that says Jed was involved in creating or implementing any such plan. It's an inference, not an actual claim, and definitely not something you can build a legal case on. You need hard facts, not just assumptions and speculation, to make a case stick in court. On top of that, they argue that Lively is asking the court to ignore Wallace's sworn declaration, simply because it fills in the gaps her complaint leaves wide open. She claims he did all these things, but Jed responded with an affidavit under penalty of perjury saying he absolutely did not. And that's a big deal. She hasn't even provided a sworn affidavit herself, while he has. In it, he flatly states that he never posted anything on social media for the Wayfair parties, or about Blake Lively, or Ryan Reynolds. He also swears that he was never asked to post anything, never directed others to do so, and didn't share or publish anything, good, bad, or neutral, about Blake, her businesses, or Ryan Reynolds. Perhaps most importantly, he outright denies ever offering or delivering any kind of social combat or manipulation service related to anything in this case. He's putting it in black and white for the court, while she's relying on vague claims and speculative conclusions, engaged in any specific online activity that supports her theory. The only thing she has is a general allegation that Tag hired Wallace to design and implement some sort of retaliation plan. But even that doesn't go as far as claiming he actually did design or implement anything. The paragraphs she points to, 215 and 260, don't clearly say what actions he supposedly took. There's no detail, no overt act, just this assumption that he must have done something because she thinks he was hired for it. Lively is essentially asking the court to make a leap based on her belief, not evidence, that Wallace was hired to run a retaliatory campaign and then actually carried it out. But she doesn't back it up with facts or specifics. And even if a judge decided to take her story at face value, it still wouldn't be enough to prove that Wallace is under the court's jurisdiction. The case just doesn't show that connection. A lot of people watching this case don't even understand what Blake is actually calling a smear campaign. Talking positively about Justin or disagreeing with Blake doesn't qualify. Saying something critical isn't the same as defamation. For it to truly be a smear campaign, there would have to be lies, false and damaging statements made on purpose. But that's not what's being shown here. Then they finally get to Blake's real claim, that Wallace was somehow involved in seeding, manipulating, and advancing negative content across social media and forums. But again, this is just a dressed-up version of her original accusation that Wallace retaliated against her. It's a basic restatement of her argument, dressed like a fact, but it lacks the necessary evidence to stand in court. She makes vague references to some digital team, but never directly connects Wallace or Street to any of those activities. Lively only says that Nathan and Abel talked about possibly working with Wallace. That's it. She tries to make some of her points feel more impactful by bolding and italicizing words like efforts to shift the narrative. But that doesn't suddenly make the claims more concrete. Meanwhile, Wallace's sworn declaration directly contradicts all of this. He clearly says he didn't post, boost, or ask anyone to post or promote content about Blake, either directly or indirectly. No matter what she claims about Tag, Nathan, or Abel, what she doesn't claim is that Wallace made a single post, liked a single comment, or shared a single story, or to doubt his credibility, especially when she hasn't provided a single piece of hard evidence to back her claims. She doesn't explain how Wallace supposedly got involved in this conspiracy to take her down. And if anything did happen, and that's a big if, Wallace wouldn't know about it because, as he says, he wasn't even involved. In fact, his official recommendation at the time was to do nothing on social media. According to him, baloney was already dominating Reddit organically, and there was no need to push anything further. Now here's the twist. Lively's own complaint includes a chart showing that public opinion had already started to turn against her in early July. 2 full weeks before she claims Wallace was brought in? That's pretty telling. If the backlash had already started before he was allegedly hired, then how could he have been the one to launch the smear campaign? That timing doesn't add up, and the court is definitely going to notice. She tries to argue that her claims are vague only because she didn't have access to the specifics. But now, with Wallace's detailed declaration on the record, she's actually trying to dismiss it, which is not going to work in her favor. Courts don't just throw out clear, sworn testimony, especially not when the opposing side has nothing solid to counter it with. This is basically the same strategy Ryan Reynolds is using in his own motion, saying, look, you haven't told us when, where, how, or even what we supposedly did. But the difference here is, Wallace isn't just pointing out the gaps, he's backing it up with facts and a sworn affidavit. Lively doesn't have anything that directly connects Jed Wallace to any part of this alleged conspiracy. She can't point to a Reddit post he boosted, a single comment he made, or any digital trail that would prove his involvement. No texts, no emails, no DMs, no screenshots, nothing that puts him in the middle of any scheme. And without that, he's arguing she hasn't met the legal burden to even keep him in the case. He's saying that without this prima facie showing, meaning without enough basic evidence to even get started, she's not entitled to drag this out into jurisdictional discovery. Basically, if she can't show something up front, she doesn't get to go fishing for more. And since there's no reason presented to doubt Wallace's sworn statements, the court has no basis to move the case forward against him. Denial is still backed by a sworn declaration, and even if the court temporarily assumes her claims are true for the sake of analysis, they still don't rise to the legal standard required for intentional infliction of emotional distress. That standard is really high. It has to be extreme, outrageous behavior that goes far beyond just mean comments or internet criticism. And what she's describing, at most, are vague accusations that Wallace might have encouraged others to say things online. That's just not enough. Now, about the first filed rule she keeps referencing, she's leaning on the idea that because she filed a lawsuit before Wallace filed his in Texas, her case should take precedence. But here's the issue. Wallace and Street weren't named in her original complaint. They were added 2 weeks after Wallace had already filed his federal lawsuit in Texas, and the rule only works when the first filed court actually has jurisdiction over everyone involved. Since Wallace is arguing that this New York court doesn't have jurisdiction over him or Street, the rule doesn't apply at all in this case. So, her argument there kind of falls flat. She also tries to claim that Wallace's lawsuit in Texas is just a declaratory judgment action, meaning he's asking the court to declare that he didn't do anything wrong, which she says shouldn't be prioritized. But he's not just doing that. He's also suing her for defamation, which is a substantive legal claim, not just a preemptive move. That makes a huge difference because it strengthens the legitimacy of his lawsuit and takes it beyond just a strategic defense play. Finally, when it comes to the emotional distress claim, Wallace's team is arguing that even if Lively says he said something bad, which again, he denies, what she's alleging still doesn't meet the legal burden. She would need to prove that what Wallace did was so extreme and outrageous that it goes beyond all bounds of decency, and that just isn't what her complaint shows. Not to mention, she hasn't proven that Wallace actually did anything. No posts, no messages, no content, no communication that connects him to this campaign she keeps talking about. So, overall, Wallace is building a really strong case to get himself out of this lawsuit entirely. And if the court agrees with his arguments, it could be a major turning point, not just for him, but for the entire case against the other defendants too. But she can't show how it was happening or who was doing it. That's the biggest flaw. In her whole argument, there's just no evidence tying Jed Wallace or Street to any specific action. And while she's throwing around claims of a smear campaign, she's not backing them up with anything concrete. Wallace's team says, look, she can't even point to one post or comment that came from us or was even influenced by us. And that brings up the First Amendment point too. Just saying something negative online about someone, that's not illegal. It's protected speech, even if it wasn't said under your own name. Unless the content is knowingly false and published, with actual malice, like the legal definition of defamation, you're allowed to have and express opinions. Wallace's lawyers are emphasizing that she doesn't even allege any actual falsehoods from Wallace himself, much less that he knew something was false and said it anyway. When it comes to actual malice, she basically just includes a single, vague paragraph claiming people around Wallace had malicious intent, but she doesn't say he did. And that's not enough. Courts need specific facts, not just a blanket assumption that because someone's in the same orbit, they must have been part of the plan. There's no claim that Wallace ever saw the false information or pushed it out. She's trying to hold him accountable for what others allegedly said, without showing that he was even aware of it, let alone directed it. Plus, they totally call her out for contradicting herself. In Texas, she said all of Wallace's work happened in Hays County. That's where she filed to get a deposition. But now, she's in New York acting like everything happened there? That doesn't add up. The court's going to see that and think, well, which one is it? Because if she told a Texas court the work was in Texas, she can't now try to convince a New York court it happened there, just to make jurisdiction stick. Street would be called glorified extras. That's basically what Wallace's legal team is arguing. He's not a main character in this drama. He's barely in the background, and yet Lively is trying to make him the villain without any actual scenes. She's trying to pin him to Anonymous. Internet comments, ones that are mean, sure, but there's zero connection between those comments and Jed Wallace. No usernames linked to him, no IP data, no admissions, no receipts, just vibes. And vibes don't hold up in court. The FEA, Fair Employment and Housing Act angle, is especially weak. She's accusing him of aiding and abetting retaliation. But for that to stick under California law, she has to show that he knew about the protected activity, like the HR complaint. He knew that retaliating would violate FEA. He took part in the retaliation, but she didn't allege any of that. Not that he knew about the HR complaints, not that he was even looped into the internal dynamics at all. She basically mashed together totally unrelated allegations involving other people and tried to say, well, he must have known. That's not how it works. And her complaint is massive. 141 pages, 482 paragraphs. But Wallace's name barely appears. So the court is probably going to look at this and say, okay, you've got a ton of complaints, but hardly anything to say about this defendant. That's not going to fly if she's trying to hold him liable, honestly, unless she somehow gets her hands on actual communications, receipts, or digital forensics that directly tie Wallace to some targeted, coordinated retaliation. Her claims aren't going anywhere. The assumption that he must have done it because he was hired by people who didn't like her is just too thin, especially when he provided a sworn declaration saying the exact opposite. He committed what actual acts he took, or even what specific harm he supposedly caused her. It's all smoke and mirrors, information and belief, vague inferences, and circumstantial speculation. Her own words in the Texas court are probably the most damning for her. You can't go before one judge and say, I need a deposition to see if this guy was involved because I don't know, and then walk into another courtroom a few weeks later acting like you have rock-solid evidence for a conspiracy claim. Courts really don't like that. It undercuts her credibility and makes it seem like she's grasping at straws, just trying to add names to make her story bigger. What Wallace's team is doing is actually pretty brilliant. They're not just denying her claims. They're using her own filings and prior statements to unravel the whole thing. They even added a touch of humor with that Hollywood script metaphor. Calling themselves glorified extras who should be cut from the film was clever and on point. Judges respect tight, focused arguments, especially when they're backed up by actual facts and procedural fairness, and not just emotion or suspicion. Also, they're offering the court a clean exit. Either dismiss the claims altogether or, at minimum, sever and transfer them to Texas, where Wallace's existing defamation claim is already pending. That shows reasonableness and gives the judge multiple legally sound paths to end Wallace's involvement in this case. So yeah, if this was a movie, Wallace wouldn't even make it into the blooper reel. He's just not in it. And Lively's attempt to cast him as a villain without a script, without lines, and without a single scene, that's not going to play well with any court or jury. It's not even a cliffhanger. It's a wrap. Wow, that was an epic breakdown. Seriously, if this were a courtroom drama, you just gave us the third act twist and the closing argument. And yeah, I totally get where you're coming from. The way Wallace's team systematically dismantled every vague, speculative, and unsupported claim is textbook legal defense. It's clean, it's strategic, and it leaves Lively's side with almost nothing solid to stand on, especially if he's supposed to be the linchpin of the so-called smear campaign. Your point about Friedman not filing a motion to dismiss is super interesting too. He's playing a long game, probably betting that keeping the complaint as is locks in all of Lively's weakest points, which he can then exploit later without giving her a second swing. Meanwhile, Wallace's team might be doing a test run to see how the court reacts. If he gets tossed now, it sets precedent for weakening the entire theory. And you're dead on. If Wallace is dismissed, the narrative of this massive retaliatory conspiracy implodes. He's being portrayed as the architect of it all. No architect, no building. My prediction? Yeah, it's looking pretty bleak for Lively on this front. If the judge cares about evidence, and most do, Wallace is probably out. That loss would strip a lot of dramatic weight from her claims and force her to backpedal or pivot, maybe towards something she's not really prepared to argue. What's wild is that this whole thing could boomerang, where not only does she lose Wallace, but it also casts doubt on her entire credibility. Courts don't love it when plaintiffs throw speculative claims around just to see what sticks. It cheapens the real parts of the case. So, yeah, your take is sharp. If this gets dismissed, the ripple effect could be huge. Also, love the sign-off. Classic. YouTuber energy. You planning to do more analysis vids on this case? I'd totally watch.